All right, Turbo saying, good evening, a good kvittel piskatava, good night. It is such a schos Baruch Hashem to be able to begin Leil Hoshana Rabbah together, Baruch Hashem, learning the daf. Also, I hope that this maybe makes things a little bit more convenient for everyone. Also, given that we're all usually Hoshana Rabbah davening different places, doing different things. So this way, Baruch Hashem, we get to be able to really get a little bit of a head start. And of course, we thank our sponsors for tonight's share. We thank our Talmud Torah sponsors for the month of Tishrei Haba Alina Latova. Yoel and Sarah Kalman, in celebration of completion of Seder Nezikin, and for Besoros Tovos for Am Yisrael, Nathan Perry Smith, and the schos of the entire Kehillah. And of course, we dedicate our learning is such a profound mix of emotions that we are experiencing as a people. On one hand, overwhelming and incredible excitement, because Emir Hashem feels like the whole universe is going to change. Emir Hashem, 8 a.m. Israel time tomorrow morning. When Emir Hashem, our brethren begin to come home. On the other hand, there's a piece of us that is so scared that there is sha'im with whom we are dealing with, the psychological warfare and just the mental and emotional manipulation is so overwhelming and beyond comprehension. There's a part of us that fears that chas v'shalom, a pullback in the last minute. But as Jews, we are always creatures of optimism. And if Hakadosh Baruch Hu has brought us this far, we have absolutely no reason to think that He's not going to continue to bring us further. So it's overwhelming. We know that again, tomorrow is going to be a day of just like, it's incredible. It's pouring outside, it's pouring inside, it's pouring everywhere. And we just feel like tomorrow is going to be a torrent of tears of joy, tears of simcha, tears of heartbreak. Every single one of those precious neshamas who comes home is also going to be a stark reminder of all of those who are never coming home. And every single family that's going to be reunited is going to be a reminder of the thousands of families who will be forever shattered. So it'll be simcha, it'll be avelos, and all of this happening again, literally, Erev Simchas Torah and Eretz Yisrael, Erev Shmini Atzeres, it's overwhelming. I think many of us are struggling to try to figure out exactly what to feel and how to feel. And on one hand, I want to be fully besimcha, but there's so much. But Emir Hashem, we definitely go into this Hoshana Rabbah saying, Hodu l'Adonai ki tov ki li'olam chasda, the Ribono shel Olam, who even in difficult times never forsakes us, never leaves us, even again, wherever we are, whether it's Auschwitz or whether it's tunnels in Gaza, Hakadosh Baruch Hu never forsakes us. And Halavai Emir Hashem tomorrow will be zocha to see V'shavu banim ligvulam, zocha Emir Hashem to see the Ribono shel Olam's children come home, and at least again, we know that not all the tears will be dried, and not all of the heartbreak of Klal Yisrael will be mended. But Emir Hashem, for at least a little bit of time, will be able to ride that beautiful wave of simcha. And halavai, it's that wave of simcha that Emir Hashem should just get bigger, should just get taller, should just become more intense, Emir Hashem, as the year goes on. We thank HaKadosh Baruch Hu for this incredible nace. We have tremendous hakar satov to all of our leadership in this country. I just saw that President Trump said the war is over. I don't know if anyone else knows about that, but Baruch Hashem. But a nice nigla, the leader of the free world, has decided to make this his priority. It is nothing short of miraculous. What the cheshbonos are, who knows? But in any event, we thank Kadosh Baruch Hu for again putting the right eitzos in the hearts of our leaders. And halavai Miras Hashem, we should be zocha tomorrow and for all future days, just to see shalom, to see bracha, and to see besoros tovos Klal Yisrael. Also with that, beautiful daf ahead of us today. Today's daf is Chavtes. Well, tomorrow's daf is Chavtes. Again, tomorrow's daf is Chavtes. We are beginning Emir Hashem today on Chavtes Base 28b, right where we left off Ela Amar Rava, which is 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 11 lines up from the bottom. Supposed to remember again, in today's daf, this morning's daf, one of the interesting things that we saw was that the Gemara quoted two different psukim. There was one pasuk from Parshas Tzav, the beginning of Vayikra, which the Gemara called the long pasuk, and then there was a second pasuk from Parshas Kedoshim, which the Gemara called the shorter pasuk. So remember again, up until now, we assumed that the first pasuk was talking about the psul of chutz lizmano, and the second pasuk was talking about the psul of chutz limkomo. And again, based on that, with exer shavav avon. In the first pasuk it says avon. Nosar it says avon. Just like nosar is punishable by kares, so too again chutz lizmano, which is pigul, is also punishable by kares. Then the Gemara challenged that whole thing, challenged the entire thing, and that's where we're picking up now. Elo Amar Rav. Rav said as follows: Kulu mikra aricha asyon. In reality, Rav says everything is learned out from the long pasuk, meaning both the psul of chutz lizmano, which is what we call pigul, and the psul of chutz limkomo, which is just what we call chutz limkomo, are both learned out from what the Gemara calls the long pasuk, which is the pasuk in Parashas Tzav. The Gemara says dichsiv. Now, how do you learn out both things from one pasuk? Because the Gemara says dichsiv he'achel yochal, or he'achel. Vim he'achol ye'achel. So it uses the double lashon of consumption. So the Gemara suggests that based on the double lashon of consumption, ultimately teaches me that it's talking about two psulim, which would run to the pasuk unfit. One chutz lizmano, one chutz limkomo. So the Gemara says, b'shtei achilos hakasav medaber. Torah is speaking about two different forms of consumption. Echad achilas adam, v'echad achilas mizbeach. One is talking about human consumption, and one is talking about mizbeach consumption. Interestingly enough, what that refers to really is chutz lizmano and chutz limkomo. So the Gemara says, mibasar zevach shlamav, mashlamim mifaglin umispaglin, afkol mifaglin umispaglin. So ultimately, again, the Gemara says as follows. First, if we take a quick look at Rashi, Rashi says over here, b'shtei achilos, it's the last short line, b'shtei achilos, shemachsheves shtehen poseles, so there are two different types of consumption that an erroneous or mistaken mindset will undermine the effectiveness of the carbon. Rashi goes on, echad achilas adam, deloshna chishev le'echal lemachar, loshna chishev lahaktir imurim lemachar pigol. This is very interesting. When it comes to pigol, so remember again, let's say I'm offering up a carbon today, and let's say for argument's sake again, I have in mind that I'm going to eat the carbon on Tuesday. So that makes the carbon pigol. If I have in mind that I'm going to burn the sacrificial parts on Tuesday, that also makes a pigul. What do you see from here? Whether your pigul machshava is with something that you're going to consume or is consumed by the mizbeach, either way, it renders the carbon invalid. Okay. Furthermore, again, the Gemara says, just like shlamim, mefaglin umispaglin, ultimately, again, I will say, so halacha l'maisa again, they are literally they can make pigul and become pigul. Afkol mefaglin umispaglin. So too again, this halacha will apply ultimately again to anything. If you look at Rashi, afkol, third wide line in Rashi, Rashi says over here, no, I'm sorry, go two lines up, I'm sorry, second wide line, mibasar zevach shlamav, hikish zvachim l'shlamim. So the Torah is equating ultimately again a zevach, which refers to a regular carbon, to a shlamim. Mash shlamim yeshpan mefaglin, v'yeshpan mispaglin, shadam hu hamifagel, v'abasar v'amur hamispaglim. So it says that's very interesting. This lesson over here of mipaglin or mifaglin umispaglin. So mifaglin means something that makes something else pigul, versus mispaglin are things that become pigul. So for example, blood doesn't become pigul, but blood makes other things pigul, as opposed to, let's say again, sacrificial parts, those are made pigul. Those become pigul. Okay. So the Gemara says, shlishi, what does shlishi come to teach me? Zeu chutz lizmano. This refers ultimately again to a machshava chutz lizmano, which means again, which is what we call pigul, which means an intention to go ahead and either, remember as we said in today's daf, either the ability to go ahead and eat, burn, or sprinkle outside of the prescribed time. Lo yeratzeh, what does that mean? Kartzas kasher, kain hartzas pasel. In the same way, ultimately, again, that a carbon kosher ultimately, again, affects acceptance, so too the same process is for a carbon pasel. What does that mean? Take a quick look at Rashi. Rashi here is 5 lines up from the bottom. Mahartzas kosher, lo karle hartza ela bizrika shusof arba avodos. So just like by a regular carbon, which is kosher, how does the carbon become kosher? Only with zrika. Af pigul eno kavua ad sheyizrok hadam shusof komatirav. So too, ultimately, again, a carbon only becomes pigul when? After zrika has been done. So it's actually an interesting fact as much as an erroneous mindset during any one of the avodos can make the carbon pigel, but the pigel designation doesn't set in until all of the processes are done. So you have to, in other words, you have to get to the process of zrika, ultimately, again, in order for the pigel designation to take place. Umahar tzas kasher ad shekriva kamatirav, af hartzas pasal ad shekriva kamatir. And just like by a kasher carbon, it's only kasher ultimately once all the permitters have been offered. So too by pigel, it's only pigel after all the permitters. What does that mean? Take a look at Rashi. Rashi says over here, sorry. So we're going to see same idea. In other words, matirav ultimately again refers to shrita kabbalah holacha zrika. So just like by regular carbon, you need all of the avodos. So too by pigel, one requires all of the avodos to have taken place as well. Hamakriv, again, this is just dissecting the pasuk. What does hamakriv mean? Ba'kravahu nifsal ve'ino nifsal b'shlishi. So both say this is very interesting. Pigel only occurs if you have the erroneous mindset during the avoda. I'll give you a different example. Let's say I'm offering up a carbon. I don't have any erroneous mindsets, but I end up, let's say, eating the carbon on the third day. So is that pigel? No. That's just called eating a carbon past the prescribed time. In order for a carbon to become pigel, you have to have a flawed mindset of chutz lizmano during one of the avodos. Right? So there's like a lot of details being filled in over here. So first of all, it only becomes pigel if you have an erroneous mindset to eat it outside of if it's prescribed time during one of the primary 4 avodos, the matirin. Number 2, it only becomes pigel if halacha l'maisa you actually finish off all of the primary sacrificial rites, meaning shchita, kabbalah, zrika. Next, hamakriv. Good. Also, what does also teach me? So this is very interesting. So the pasuk, the lashon of the pasuk is also. Right? So the pasuk ultimately says also, which means that halacha l'maisa again, the one who goes ahead and offers it ultimately, again, will not be effective. It will not be accepted. So the Gemara says, what's the it? What's the it? So the Gemara understands amazingly that the it refers to the carbon and not the Kohen. Now, what does that mean? I might have thought that if a Kohen goes ahead and offers up with a machshavas pigel, then maybe what? Maybe the Kohen should become disqualified as well. Maybe what pigel does is 2 things. It disqualifies a carbon and it disqualifies a Kohen. Kamash malan, that ultimately, that's what? The carbon becomes disqualified, the Kohen does not. Which I will say, by the way, what a beautiful lesson to learn on Leil Hoshana Rabbah, which again, as we'll discuss in our next year, is really part and process of the journey of tshuva. This yisod, mistakes could ultimately invalidate the carbon, but mistakes aren't going to chas shalom invalidate a Kohen.
Is the carbon with the machshava correct? I mean, the Kohen's going to sit there and tell
no one's ever going to know about pigel unless the Kohen confesses. He would feel bad. He wants to be about tshuva. Because I don't know. We have to operate under a system that Kohanim don't do this. But if they would do it, because remember, if you're a Kohen and you do this, so there's a lot of things at stake. Let's say somebody's bringing a carbon chatas, a sin offering, and now you're a Kohen and you had a machshavas pigel, you've prevented their carbon from affecting atonement. So I don't know. Did it happen? When it happened? How many times were there confessions? I don't know. But yes, the only way you would know about this is if the Kohen went ahead and admitted it, or I guess if the Kohen told his friend, a little too much to drink, at the Kiddush, so he told his friend about this time that he made a carbon pigel, but otherwise, if it's not from him, no one's going to know it. So the Gemara goes weiter. So cool, it's good. So good. Lo yichashev, top of Chav test, 29a, lo ye'arav b'machshavas acheros. So we'll say very interesting, another halacha, which is that in order for a carbon to become pigel, it could only be that you have a machshavas pigel. In other words, if you mix in any other disqualifying mindsets, the carbon is no longer pigel, which is fascinating, right? So just to give you a classic example of this, if during, let's say during the Kabbalah, you had in mind to go ahead and eat the carbon outside of the prescribed time, chutz lizmano, and then let's say again by holacha, you had in mind to eat it chutz limkomo, outside of its place, so the carbon is pasul, but it's not pigul. The only time a carbon becomes pigul is if the only disqualifying mindset you had during the sacrificial process was for pigul, chutz lizmano. But if you kind of interspersed, if you included other disqualifying mindsets, the carbon will still be pasul, but not pigul. Incredible. So the Gemara says pigul zeh. So the Gemara says pigul zeh chutz limkomo. So pigul zeh. So the Gemara says, what does it mean that it's pigul or pigul yiyeh? Zeh pigul. When the pasuk says pigul zeh chutz limkomo. Ultimately, again, that refers specifically to the erroneous mindset of chutz limkomo, outside of its prescribed area. Yihiyeh malamish shemitztarfen zeh zeh. This is very interesting. So Yihiyeh tells us that ultimately, again, erroneous mindsets combine with each other. Now, what does it mean they combine with each other? They combine with each other to invalidate the carbon. But as we just said before, our carbon only becomes pigul and therefore generates a chiyuv kares if that's the only disqualifying mindset that you have. V'hanefesh ha'ocheles mimenu. So the pasuk says that someone who eats from this carbon will get kares. Echad v'lo shnayim. That only refers to one of the disqualifications and not both. In other words, remember, there's two disqualifications being learned out from the pasuk over here. Both chutz limkomo and chutz lizmano. So the Torah says, v'acheles mimenu, if one eats from it teaches me that only one type of disqualification generates a kares liability, not both. Ve'eza, which one is it that generates a kares liability? So the Gemara says, ze chutz lizmano, the gamar avon minosar the damile bizab. So remember again, so which one is it that generates a kares liability? Ultimately, again, it's going to be chutz lizmano. Right, chutz lizmano. Why chutz lizmano? Because gzer shabav avon from nosar, and in general, again, chutz lizmano is like nosar. Why? Because it shares two similarities, zab, which means zman. They're both a function of time, and they both apply on a bama. We had that in today's daf. So we'll say, so again, just to pause here for just a moment, what Rava just did is really turned things around. When Rava said, whereas beforehand our thought was that chutz lizmano and chutz limkomo are learned out from two different psukim, Rava said no. Everything's learned out from the Gemara calls the long pasuk. What's the long pasuk? The pasuk in Parshas Tzav. Everything is learned out there. Chutz lizmano, chutz limkomo, and also the idea that, first of all, a lot more details about chutz lizmano and chutz limkomo, and also that kares only applies to chutz limkomo, only applies to chutz lizmano, not to chutz limkomo. Incredible. So Rava said to Rava, Ladidach, Shlishi de Parshas Kedoshim, Tihiyu, my darashtabai. So Rava, according to you, then what do you use the pasuk in Parshas Kedoshim for? Right? Because again, we have another pasuk in Parshas Kedoshim. So if you just darshan everything from the first pasuk in Parshas Tzav, then what do you do with the second pasuk? So Gemara says, Ahomi baile. I'll tell you what we need it for. Ahomi baile lemakom sheyehei mishulash bedam bebasar ubeimurin. It teaches me that halacha l'maisa, in order for a machshava either chutz lizman or chutz limkomo, to effectively undermine the carbon, it has to take place. In other words, one has to have in mind that whatever they're going to do is going to take place in an area where blood could be sprinkled, meat could be consumed, and sacrificial parts could be offered. If halacha l'maisa, the machshava for chutz lizman or chutz limkomo does not go ahead and include a place that fits those three criteria, ultimately it does not undermine the carbon. Incredible. So why not learn that from the previous pasuk? After all, so ultimately, since the Torah ultimately again highlights with lashon of shlishi, if you were throwing that out from the previous pasuk, shlishi prat pigul klal, I would have thought like this: shlishi is a prat, specific statement. Pigul is a klal, a general statement. Benasa klal mosif ala prat, and therefore again the klal is adding on to the prat. V'esrabu sharma komos, and therefore that would include other spaces as well. Even if it's not a space ultimately again where the meat can be consumed, the blood can be sprinkled, and the emurim ultimately again can that that's not the case. Incredible. Shabbos says, so it turns out that the Gemara really seems to accept Rava's idea, namely that halacha l'maisa, both chutzlim komo and chutzliz mano are learned out from what the Gemara calls the long pasuk, which is the pasuk in Parshas Tzav. And again, we also learn out that the prohibition, or they should say the punishment of kares, only applies to chutzliz mano, does not apply to chutzlim komo, and that's based on a gzeira shav of avon from nosar. Avon nosar. What does and similarities with nosar? So what does Rava then do with the second pasuk, right, in Parshas Kedoshim? So that pasuk, the Gemara suggests that he goes ahead and he uses that to teach me that halacha l'maisa, that if you have a machshava of chutzlim komo, then halacha l'maisa, it has to be in an area, or in other words, you have to have in mind that whatever you're going to do has to still be in an area where ultimately, again, sacrificial meat can be consumed, blood could be sprinkled, and sacrificial parts could be burned. Incredible. Let's go right to Tanabanon. V'im he'achol ye'achel mibasar zevach shlamov. So we'll say, going back to what we call the long pasuk in Parshas Tzav, so this is actually a very beautiful lashon. Rabbi Lezer says, literally, bend your ear and listen attentively. Rabbi Lezer is saying, I have something very good to tell you. Make sure to pay attention. So the Gemara, listen to this. So Kol oznecha lishma b'mechashev lechol mizivcho b'yom hashlishi hakasuv medaber. So again, Rabbi Lezer says like this. That what's the case over here? We're talking about someone who has in mind ultimately again to eat on the third day. What does third day mean? Chutz lizmano. Right? So again, I want to point out, so Rabbi Eliezer seems to be echoing the idea of Rava, that halach l'maisa, long pasuk, is teaching me both. But again, specifically, v'im he'achol ye'achal mibasar zevach shlamav bayom hashlishi, that is referring to chutz lizmano, outside of the permitted time, and it's punishable kares. Maybe not. Maybe it's not talking about someone who had an erroneous mindset, but rather, again, maybe it's talking about someone ultimately, again, who's eating on the third day. And I will say, this goes back to what we said before. Let's say stam, right? I offer a carbon on Sunday. All right, so let's assume in a typical carbonic situation, I have 2 days and 1 night to eat it. So I have Sunday and Monday. When I shecht it, I have absolutely no erroneous mindset. I'm just shechting it. But it turns out that I eat it on Tuesday. Is that carbon pigul? So the Gemara is suggesting no. The only way a carbon becomes pigul is if you have that flawed mindset during one of the 4 primary avodas: shchita, Kabbalah, holacha, zerika. But if you just end up eating it late, okay, you're eating it out of the permitted window, but that's not called pigul. So the Gemara says, how do you know? Maybe not. Maybe we're just talking about a case where the carbon is eaten on the third day. And maybe halacha l'maisa, again, there's just liability for that. That's also called chutz lizmano. So the Gemara says, Amrit, echad shu kasher yachsar v'yipasal. So we'll say, that can't be, because what would that effectively mean? That would effectively mean that a carbon was once kosher and then becomes pasul. Meaning that, watch this. I offered up the carbon on Sunday, right? So with no erroneous mindset. So Sunday, the carbon is fine. Sunday night, the carbon is fine. Monday, the carbon is fine. Now I end up eating it on Tuesday. So what are you going to say? Now on Tuesday it becomes pigul, and therefore what? That retroactively the carbon was pasul the entire time. Where do we ever see a concept like that a carbon becomes retroactively pasul? That can't be. I want to be keep what are you talking about? Of course we do. Hein matzinu bezav v'zava v'shomer keneged yom v'eskestara v'chevan sherau sasru. That's not true. Take a case of a zav. We will say, what's a zav, right? So a zav is a guy who has an emission, a non-seminal emission. So what happens? If he sees one day, he's shomer yom keneged yom, right? He has to observe a corresponding day of purity. If he sees 2 days, shiva nekiyim. If he says 3 days, shiva nekiyim, and then what? And then a carbon. So a zav is a perfect example. Before he sees those 2 times, or even the 3 times, certainly even the 2 times, halacha l'maisa is a cheskes tara. Once he goes ahead and he sees a second time or a third time, retroactively his status changes. So we see the concept that a subsequent event could change a reality retroactively. Afata al tetame al zeh. So why should you be so? Well, maybe not. Maybe maybe if I leave over my carbon until Tuesday, maybe that carbon does become pigel, and retroactively that carbon was invalid. Maybe retroactively becomes puzzle. Amrle harehu omer hamakriv b'shas hakravahu nifsal ve'lo nifsal b'shlishi. No, because the pasuk says hamakriv. I was supposed to say when does something become pigel? Hamakrivo. So when you offer it. So carbon only becomes pigel if there is an erroneous, flawed mindset during the process of hakrav, offering. Specifically, again, shchita, kabbalah, holacha, zrika. So the Gemara says, nifsal I eino omer hamakriv elazah kohen hamakriv. But 1 second, maybe when it says hamakriv, maybe that means that the kohen becomes puzzle. Maybe a kohen who goes ahead and offers with an erroneous mindset, maybe he becomes disqualified for the kahuna, to which the Gemara says, Kishu Omer Oso Bezevachim Medaravenu Medaravakoin. When it says Oso is referring to the carbon and is not referring to the kohen. Ben Azai Omer, Ben Azai says as follows. So the Gemara says, it's interestingly enough, just the point to isolate over here, which is, because again, a lot of this is what Rabbi Elazar is repeating is a lot of what Rava said already. Everything learned that from the first pasuk. What is fascinating about this is this particular point where in order for a carbon to become pigel, there has to be an erroneous mindset during the actual sacrificial process. Leaving a carbon over to the third day outside of its prescribed time makes it unusable, right? It's essentially no sar, but that does not make it pigel. You can't have retroactive pigel. So the Gemara says, Ben Azai says, oso, when it says oso, matam, what does that mean? So we'll say, listen to this. I would have thought like this. The Torah says, kisidor neder l'Hashem. If you make a neder, right, you vow to bring an offering. So the Torah says, lo sacher l'shalmo. Do not delay in paying what you owe. Right? So in other words, if you commit to bringing something to the Beis HaMikdash, do not delay. I would have thought, Yochol, Af, Hama'achar, Nidro below Yiratza. So I will say, by the way, just as an aside, amazingly enough, what's the window for let's say I make an edge, I'm going to bring shlamim. So how long do you have? You have 3 regalim. 3 regalim. It's actually a beautiful Gemara to learn. So if I were to make a neder now on Sukkot, that I'm going to bring a shlamim, so ultimately, again, I have Pesach, Shavuos through the next Sukkot. What happens if, let's say, I delay it past Sukkot? I don't bring it. I would have thought below Yeratza. I would have thought, therefore, maybe the carbon can't be offered. Talmud Lamar oso below Yeratza. No. It's only like a carbon that's left beyond its permitted window for consumption that is now illegal for consumption. But ultimately, again, a carbon, let's say that you were supposed to bring, but you delayed bringing, even though it's delayed, I'm in violation for delaying it. But at the end of the day, halach l'maisa, the carbon could still be brought. Achirim say, lo yechashev, v'machshavahu nifsal ve'eno nifsal b'shlishi, is what we just said before. Achirim say, lo yechashev, pigel only occurs with an erroneous mindset during one of the primary sacrifice services. But simply leaving over the carbon to the third day does not make it pigel. Ayu ben azai. So Ben Azai, how do you know that the pasuk is talking about the disqualification of the carbon, but a kohen who has a machshavas pigel ultimately himself doesn't become disqualified? He can learn from the drasha de achirim. So the Gemara says, lo yirtzeh zivchohu. When it says ultimately it will not be accepted, it's not wanted. What's not wanted? The carbon. But of course, that doesn't refer to the kohen. I'm sorry, uben azai. Oso below yiratzeh ve'in ma'achar nidro below yiratzeh mehacha nafka. Where does Ben Azai learn that if you were supposed to bring a carbon during a certain time and you missed your window, or you're past your window, how do I know that the carbon is not invalid? So we'll say, so again, this is what we just mentioned before. I make a neder to bring a shlamim. 3 regalim go by and I still didn't bring the carbon. How do I know that the carbon is still permitted to be offered? In other words, I'm in violation for delaying, but how do I know that the carbon is not disqualified? The carbon ultimately, again, can be brought, to which the Gemara says, good. Mehalcha nafka, second to last line, mehalcha nafka, sorry, v'lo yiratzeh ve'ima acher nidro b'lo yiratzeh mehacha nafka mid'achirim nafka. Disan yachirim omrim yachol yehei b'char she'ibr shnaso. I would have thought about say this: a b'char. What's the halacha by a b'char animal? So a b'char animal is kodesh, belongs to the kohen. So I might have thought that a b'char animal that now went past its first year amud beis kipsuli hamukdashin v'pasal. And I will say the halacha is that the b'char animal is supposed to be given to the kohen within the first year. What happens if you didn't? I would have thought that if the first year goes by and the kohen, and I didn't give the firstborn animal to the kohen, then maybe again it becomes like a blemished sacrificial item and precluded for non-use, or I should say, set aside for non-use. Tabalomar, v'yachalta lefnei Hashem elokecha ma'asar degancha. The Torah says you shall eat before Hashem the tithing of your grain. Makish bachar lemaiser. It compares bachar to meiser, meaning what? Ma meiser eno nifsal mishana lechaverta. So we'll say, just like by tithes, different years have different tithes. And obviously, again, you're supposed to go ahead and distribute your tithe. You're not supposed to hold it. We'll say, there's an interesting shaila like this. Let's say a person, right? One of the good things that's important to set up if a person doesn't have it is a meiser account. Right? A meiser account, that way a person gets paid. It's good to just have an account that you could put your meiser in, so you know that it's set aside. There's an interesting shaila in the post-game. What if I just want to accumulate money in my Meiser account? Like, in other words, I'm not taking, obviously, I set aside for tzedakah, but like, I don't know, like maybe I want to think about giving a large gift somewhere. I don't have anything specific. Obviously, if something specific in mind, that's one thing. But let's say I don't have anything specific in mind, but, I want to let it accumulate. So there's an interesting discussion in the postscript in general about whether one is supposed to allow tzedakah to accumulate or if one should really dispense it as it comes in. Obviously, if let's say I have in mind to give a large gift that's tzedakah, so I'm looking to give, that's something different. But assuming one has no cheshbonos like that, there is a school of thought that says, right, as they call it, FIFO, a little bit of accounting over here, right? First in, first out, right? In other words, that halacha l'maaseh again, get it out. There's no reason to sit on tzedakah. Let your money, or let HaKadosh Baruch Hu's money do good works. I'm just pointing that over here because the pasuk says over here by Meiser, interestingly by Meiser, the halacha is every year has a different tithe, or different years have different tithes. Ideally, you're supposed to give out the tithes in the year. Let's say you didn't. So remember again, in the third year of the Shemitah cycle, there's something called Vidui Meiser, right? This beer, which was when you kind of give away all of your tithes. So I'm just pointing out, you see this concept also, even just biblically, where ideally give out your tithes, in the respective times. But if it accumulated, okay, you give it out then, fine. So the Gemara says, Makish b'char l'meiser. Ma meiser eno nifsal mishana l'chaverta. If you didn't dispense your meiser and you held on to it, so meiser doesn't become disqualified just because you didn't give it out. Af eno nifsal mishana l'chaverta. So to b'char, ultimately, again, does not become disqualified 1 year to the next. This is very important. That although I'm supposed to give my bechor animal to the Kohen during his first year, if I did not do so, ultimately, again, the animal remains permitted. Rabbi said, interestingly, the Gemara says, Itzterich. I need both of these limudim. Why? So I would have thought like this. Hani mili bechar. The lav bar hartzahu. So I would have thought like this, that maybe this only applies to bechor. Why? Because bechar does not affect any kind of atonement. So maybe if a bechar, even if you delay it, you can still offer it out. Aval kach, you can still offer it up. Aval kachim debnei hartzaninu ema lo lirtzu. But by karbanos, which ultimately again are there to affect some type of atonement or some type of comprehensive change. Perhaps if you don't offer it up in the right time, perhaps it should not be offered. Kamashal, that's not the case. Kamashal said that even if a carbon, Nabosah, again, this is not to be confused. There are certain carbonos that have, like a carbon pesach, has to be an animal within its first year. If it ages out, you can't offer it. That's why the paradigmatic example of this is like a neder, where again, I vow to give a shlamim. I have 3 regalim to make good on that. I missed my window. So now I would have thought the havamina is the carbon can't be offered. Kamash Malan, yes it can. Yes it can. So the Gemara goes like, are we learning it out from there? The Gemara says, we learn out from different sources. Torah says that if you delay in fulfilling your obligations, that is sinful. It is sinful to delay your obligations. But the sin is on who? The sin ultimately, again, is on me. It's not on my carbon. Therefore, the carbon is still fit for use. To which the Gemara says, Ben Azai doesn't like that limud. Why? Now I said, this is wild. The Gemara says, Ben Azai uses it for a different limud. What's his limud? That ultimately, again, if you delay in bringing a carbon, ultimately that is your responsibility and not your wife's. Not your wife's. You bear responsibility for that. Your wife does not. What does that mean? Listen, this was wild Gemara. Sound like you would have thought, Hov Amr Belazar, you might have thought as follows, right? Because Rabbi Elazar says, and some say Rabbi Yochanan, Rabbi says this is a wild Gemara. Ein ishto shel adam ela imki mevakshin mimenu mamon ve'ein lo. So Rabbi say a wife dies, right? A man's wife dies. Now we'll explain this. If at the end of the day they ask him for money and he doesn't give it. Rabbi say, now what does that mean? What does that mean? It's referring to someone who owes money and doesn't pay back their debts. So someone who owes money and doesn't pay back their debts, what the punishment, the Gemara says for that, is one's wife passes away. Okay, now we're going to explain this a little bit more. So the Gemara says as follows. The Gemara says, Shinamar, what does the pasuk mean? The Gemara quotes the pasuk from Mishlei. If you don't have what to pay back, Lama yikach mishkavcha mitachtecha. Why should Hashem take your bed from under you? So the bed is a euphemism for one's wife. And here the Navi says, Shlomo Melech says, if you don't have what to pay, why should Hashem take your wife? So from here you see that if a person doesn't pay back his debts, unfortunately, HaKadosh Baruch Hu takes his wife. What's the Pshat? Well, so in general, whenever we see Gemaras like this, so Chazal often used extreme language in order to highlight a point. It was saying, what does it mean if a person is not making good on their debts? What does that mean? What does that mean? That you're not a person who keeps their commitments. Because remember, Chazal aren't talking about over here an extenuating circumstance, right? A person chas v'shal suffer devastating loss. They can't. It's not what we're talking about over here. Because again, there's a concept, only it's Rachmana Patra, extenuating circumstances. Extenuating circumstances, the halacha understands that as well, exempts you. We're talking about a person who's not paying back his debt. This is a person who doesn't take his responsibilities seriously. He owes something to other people and he's not making good on his commitments. And I will say, a person who is not making good on his commitments to other people, most probably is not making good on his commitments to his wife either. If you're not a person who stands by his word, if you're not a person who honors his commitments, and you're doing that with other people, most probably you're doing that in your marriage as well. And if you're doing that in your marriage, the Gemara says, sometimes you see the lashon of mesa, of death. Death doesn't have to mean death. Death could also mean loss. If you don't honor your commitments to your wife, if you don't honor your responsibilities to your wife, the Gemara says, essentially, you're going to become a person who doesn't honor commitments to anyone or anything. Because if you can't honor your commitments to your life partner, then really you have zero credibility. If you can't honor your commitments to the person with whom you share a life, then by definition, you're certainly not going to honor any other commitments as well. So perhaps that's the pshat over here. Ein ishto she'adam meisa doesn't necessarily have to mean a man's wife is going to die. What it does mean is he's going to lose his marriage. Why does a person lose his marriage? There are very many reasons. But one of the reasons is mevakshin mimenu mamon ve'ein lo, because you're not a person who takes commitment seriously. If you're borrowing money and you're not making good on paying it back, that means you don't take commitments seriously. And if you don't take your commitments with others seriously, chances are you're not taking your commitments in marriage seriously either. And if that's the case, unfortunately, a marriage like that is doomed to fail. Incredible. So the Gemara says, I might have thought, so I would have thought again that maybe if a husband delays bringing a carbon, perhaps that's considered paying back a debt. And maybe again, this same like statement of Chazal that he loses his wife should apply over here also. Kamashlan, no. Kamashlan that if the husband delays in bringing his carbon, that's not like not paying a debt. It's surely not good. But Allah said the husband is liable, but the wife is not. Incredible. So we keep circling back to this same core point, which is a carbon only becomes pigul when, if halacha l'maisa, the machshavas pigul ultimately was during one of the sacrificial services. But again, if you just eat the meat on the third day, that does not make the carbon pigul. It's usher, you're not allowed to do that, but that does not make the carbon pigul. So therefore you can only make something pigul if you have an erroneous mindset, but not by simply eating it on the third day. Rabbi Eliezer, lo yichashev ma'avid. What does Rabbi Eliezer do with the phrase lo yichashev? So we boil lichid Rabbi Yanai. Then Rabbi Yanai, minay lemachshavos shemotzios zumizu. So this is very interesting. How do I know that now literally again, that halacha l'maisa, we mentioned this before, a carbon only becomes pigel if what? If chutz lizmano is the only disqualifying mindset you have. But if halacha l'maisa, again, you have other disqualifying mindsets included there, the carbon does not become pigel. It's still possible, right? So just to give you an example of this, I do Kabbalah, and during Kabbalah, I have in mind to eat the carbon on Tuesday, chutz lizmano. That's pigel. Then let's say by halacha, I have in mind to eat the carbon, in Tel Aviv. That's chutz limkomo, right? So now clearly the carbon is still going to be puzzle, but there's no chi of kares. It's not called pigel because the carbon can only be pigel. The chutz lizmano disqualification is the only erroneous mindset I'm having. If there's other stuff mixed in there, carbon is puzzle, but not pigel. So that's what it means. So how do I know that literally, again, different disqualifying mindsets literally exclude each other? So if I have something else in there besides chutz lizmano, it takes out a pigel. Shneimar lo yechashev lo ye'arev bo machshavos acheros. If the carbon is going to be pigel, you can't mix in any other mindsets in there. Any other flawed mindsets? How do you know that halacha l'maisa if you have a machshava, right, an erroneous mindset, by kachim, that you get malchus? Shabbos says, just to point out something very interesting. So halacha l'maisa, when you have a machshavas pigel, you're getting kares, but with kares, you also get malchus. Right? Now again, as Ramat said before, obviously, no one but the Kohen knows this, and the only way this comes to light is if he admits it, if he does tshuva, right? But Lamaisa, again, interestingly enough, if the Kohen comes to Beis and he says, "Chavra, I'm sorry, I want to be about tshuva. Everybody wants to be about tshuva. I want to be about tshuva. I had a machshavas pigel when I was sprinkling the blood. I had in mind to eat the carbon that I shechted on Sunday. I had in mind to eat it on Tuesday. Okay, so what says now that's subject to kares, but ultimately, again, also malchus, lashes. So the Gemara says. How do we know that? One second. How can you get malchus for pigel? After again, pigel is a lav she'ein bomaisa, right? It is a prohibition that doesn't have an action. Remember again, how do you do pigel abosai? In your mind. It's all a mindset. So in general, we have a rule that you only get malchus for actual physical activity infractions. But an erroneous mindset you don't get malchus for. This reflects the view of Rabbi Yehuda, because Rabbi Yehuda holds ultimately again that you even get malchus on a lav she'ein b'maisa. Incredible. All right, Jabosai, what a beautiful and incredible sugya. Let's go back. Let's do the Mishnah. Zeh klal. So actually, this Mishnah is very interesting. This just you should understand structurally. This Mishnah is considered to be attached to the previous Mishnah, which is why you're going to see that much of the information in this Mishnah we actually already covered in the previous Gemara. So watch this. Says the Mishnah, Zeh klal, this is the rule. Kol hashochet v'hamekabel v'halech v'hazorek le'echol davar. So let's do this. Here's the rule, right? Anyone who shechts, shchida, kabbalah, receives the blood, mahalech, right, walks the blood over to the mizbeach, zorek, sprinkles the blood, le'echol davar shedarko le'echol, ulahaktir davar shedarko lahaktir, right? And again, he has in mind to, let's say again, eat something that's normally consumed or burn something that's normally burned. Kizayis chutz limkomo. And so again, this chutz limkomo, I have in mind to go ahead and either eat a kizayis of carbon, in Tel Aviv, or I have in mind to burn a kizayis of carbon in Tel Aviv, outside of the prescribed area. What's talaka? Pasul, the carbon is invalid. Ve'ein bo kares, but there's no kares. Because remember again, kares only comes for pigel. Pigel is only chutz lizmano, not chutz limkomo. Chutz lizmano, pigel b'chayim of kares. But again, if you had in mind to go ahead and either eat, burn, or sprinkle outside of the permitted time, that becomes pigel and punishable by kares. Ubilvad sheyakriv hamater kimitzvaso. So this is very interesting. The criteria over here is that halacha l'maisa, the carbon only becomes pigel when? If you end up doing zrika. We actually saw this before, right? The carbon only becomes pigel if you go through all the sacrificial parts, namely the permitter. The permitter is zrika, because it's zrika ultimately, again, is the primary part of the avoda. So interestingly enough, a carbon only becomes pigel if you go through all of the sacrificial steps. Keitzad, for example, karav hamatir kimitzvaso, if you went ahead and you offered up the matir, the permitter, which is sprinkling of the blood in the right way. So, for example, shachat. So what's an example of karav hamatir kimitzvaso? So, just give me an example. Let's say what we want an example is a paradigmatic case of pigel. Give me a pigel case. So the Gemara says, here we go. Shachat b'shtika. So what happens? I was saying, what does shachat b'shtika mean? Shachat b'shtika means you shachted with no erroneous mindset. By the way, there's also like a profundity in that phrase. Sometimes you can manage kill people with silence. Right? The worst thing in relationships is silence. Right? It's true in a marriage, it's true in a friendship. There's a falling out, which inevitably happens. There's difficulties, inevitably happens, and there's such a reflexive, almost like reaction for everyone to retreat into their corners of silence. So everyone knows silence does absolutely nothing to address relationships problems. The only thing it usually does is, now granted, sometimes you do need a little bit of like a cooling off period, so you don't want to say anything foolish, right? But prolonged silence never happens. So because why Gemara says, shachat b'shchita, shachat b'shtika. Sometimes, again, you could kill someone. You could destroy a relationship with silence. So, but again, here, shachat b'shtika means you shachted the animal with no erroneous mindset. Kibel, v'halach, v'zar chutz lizmano. And then either you did kabbalah, holacha, or zrika with a mindset, chutz lizmano. So go ahead and do it on Tuesday, right? Oh, sheshachat chutz lizmano, v'kibel, v'halach, v'zar b'shtika. Or you shachted with the intention to ultimately, again, go ahead and either eat it, burn it, sprinkle it outside of the prescribed time. And then you did Kabbalah, Holach, and Zrika without any erroneous mindset. Oh, sheshachat v'kiba v'halach v'zar chutz lizmano. Or you did all of the things with the kavanah for chutz lizmano. Zeu shemakriv hamatir kimitzvas. And I will say, what is this teaching me? Two things. Number one, you don't have to have a chutz lizmano mindset for all of the avodos. All you needed is for what? Is for one. But the carbon only becomes pigel if you end up doing all the sacrificial parts. Namely, you get through zrika. If you don't get to zrika, ultimately the carbon does not become pigel. So I must do shchita, kabbalah, holacha, zrika. Oh, I need all of that. But at the same time, halacha l'maisa, I don't have to go ahead and have the erroneous mindset by all of the steps, just by one of them. So the Gemara says, Keitzad lo karav hamatir kimitzvaso. What's the example ultimately again, where I did not fulfill the matir in the right way? The Gemara says, for example, shachat chutz limkomo. For example, again, I did shchita with the intention of eating the carbon outside of its prescribed place. Kibel b'halach v'zarach chutz lizmano. And then I do the rest of the avodas also chutz lizmano. I'm sorry, then those are the chutz lizmano. So we'll say, what happened in this case over here? In this case, you have a mixture of erroneous mindset. I had shchita, chutz limkomo, and everything else chutz lizmano. So remember, we saw already, what happens when you do that? What happens when you do that? The carbon is pasul, but not pigel. O sheshachat chutz lizmano, first wide line. O sheshachat chutz lizmano, kibel v'halach v'zarak chutz limkomo. Or, for example, again, I did shchita, chutz lizmano. I had the mindset of chutz lizmano, and then kabbalah holach azrika chutz limkomo. Oh, sheshachat v'kiba b'halach v'zarach chutz limkomo. So we'll say, so again, in all of these cases, what's happening over here is I'm mixing in other mindsets, other erroneous mindsets with chutz lizmano. When you do that, the carbon will be pasul, but will not be pigel. Second wide line. The Gemara says, furthermore, haPesach v'achatas. Oh, this is very exciting. So we'll say this is a little bit of a throwback to the beginning of the Masechta. Remember again, we'll say, what's unique about Pesach and Chatas? Pesach and Chatas are the only carbonates where if they are not offered lishma, they are pasul. VaPesach v'achatas sheshachtan shelo lishman. If they're shachted shelo lishma, v'kibel v'halach v'zarach chutz limkomo, and then ultimately again, then there's shchita, right? There's shachtan shel lishman, right? I shachted shelo lishman, v'kiba v'halach v'zar chutz lizmano, and then I did kabbalah holach and zrika chutz lizmano. Oh, sheshachat chutz lizmano, v'kiba v'halach v'zar shelo lishman. Oh, sheshachat v'kiba v'halach v'zarak daman shelo lishman, zeu shelo karav hamatir kimitzvaso. So we're saying in all of these cases, what do you see happening? Halacha l'maisa again, there's a mixture of mindsets happening over here, mixture of erroneous mindsets, and therefore halacha l'maisa, Halach l'maisa, when that occurs, ultimately the carbon will be pasul, but will not become pigel. Lechol kizayis b'chutz, kizayis l'machar. Bless you. What happens if I have in mind to eat a kizayis outside of the prescribed time and a kizayis outside of the permitted time, right? I'm sorry, out of the prescribed area and then outside of the permitted time. So the Gemara says, kizayis l'machar, right? Kizayis l'machar, kizayis b'chutz. Or again, opposite. Kichatzi zayis b'chutz, kichatzi zayis l'machar. Or half a kizayis outside of the permitted area, half a kizayis outside the permitted time. Kichatzi zayis l'machar, kichatzi zayis b'chutz. Pasul ve'im bo kares. Shabbos say that this seems to be the same case as we just said before, which is I have two different erroneous mindsets, both chutz lizmano and chutz limkomo. Whenever that happens, what's the halacha? Carbon is pasul, but ultimately again, not pig. Rabbi Yehuda says like this: Zeh klal, this is the rule. Kol shemachshavas hazman kadma lemachshavas hamakom pigol vechayavan alav kares. V'machshavas hamakom kidla machshavas hazman pasul ve'im bo kares. Rabbi Yehuda disagrees. Rabbi Yehuda says like this: even with differing erroneous mindsets, you can still make a carbon pigol, as long as what? As long as the chutz lizmano flawed mindset was first. If that's the first erroneous mindset you have, then even if you subsequently have chutz lim komo afterwards, the carbon will be pigel. But if you first had chutz lim komo and then had chutz lizmano, the carbon cannot become pigel. It will be pasul, but not pigel. The Chum saying no, incorrect. Zeh pasul ve'ein bo kares. The Chum disagree. The Chum say, which is, I will say, the position that we've been echoing over and over again, which is that halacha l'maisa, the only way a carbon becomes pigel is if that is the only mindset you have for chutz lizmano outside of the prescribed time, then you had it during one of the avodos and you completed all of the avodos. Shchita, kabbalah, holacha, zrika. But if you mix in there any other erroneous, flawed mindset, the carbon will be pasul, but will not be pigel. To conclude the Mishnah, kechatzi zayis lahaktir, kechatzi zayis kosher. The Gemara is, kechatzi zayis lahaktir, kechatzi zayis kosher, she'ina achila v'aktara mitztarfen. So the Gemara says as follows. The Gemara then says, halacha l'maisa, if you have ultimately again, a half a kizayis, ultimately again, to go ahead and burn. Rashi says over, lechoch, kechatzi kizayis lahaktir, kechatzi kizayis, u'shteim chutz lizmano, o chutz limkomo. Shabbos is very interesting. Let's say I have in mind, I'm going to burn half a kizayis outside of the permitted time and eat half a kizayis outside of the permitted time. So what's interesting about this? Both cases, it's two different actions. One is burning and one is eating. But for both of them, my intention is to do it outside of the permitted time. So the Gemara says, ultimately, again, kosher. Now the Gemara says kosher, the carbon is kosher. Now what that means, we'll have to see. Why? Now, leaving aside what exactly kosher means, here's what I do know, which is, it's not pigel. Right? Why is it not pigel? Because ultimately, again, a half a kizayis of eating and a half a kizayis of burning, even though I have in mind to do both of them outside of the permitted time, do not combine. Those are two different activities, therefore it does not combine to form a kizayis of pigel, and therefore halacha l'maisa again, the carbon is kosher. Now, it's interesting that the Gemara says kosher, right? Does kosher mean that it's kosher? Or kosher means no, that it's pasul, but I'm not chayiv kares. Okay, so that Amirat Hashem remains to be seen. But bottom line is that halacha l'maisa, even a half a kizayis to burn and to eat, even though both have the same erroneous mindset of chutz lizmano, cannot combine to form pigel. Bosai, shkoyach. Incredible. Incredible. All right, Chevron, have a great day, everyone. A great day, I mean, a good evening. A good kvittel. A good kvittel, everyone. We'll say, everyone is invited. We're going to be, the Chassidus Chabura Meretz Hashem is right next door. Right next door, Meretz Hashem. We're going to get started in just a moment. Shkoyach, everyone.